The Rundown with Carrie Saldo podcast is funded by Armbrook Village Senior Living in Westfield, offering assisted living and compass memory support with evidence-based treatment for those with memory loss. More at armbrookvillage.com.
This is The Rundown, your weekly news and review from Western Mass. I'm Carrie Saldo. Good morning. Happy Friday, everyone. It is March 28th, 2025. And joy in Red Sox Nation, thanks in part to this ninth inning moment.
It is out of here. Abreu again, and the Red Sox break it open. A three-run laser beam.
Will your Abreu take a bow, buddy? My goodness.
Brilliant color there, that MLB highlight from Google Cloud. It was a 5-2 victory for the Sox in their opener against the Rangers at yesterday's season opener. And, we can just let the cheering continue as I introduce this week's Rundowners. Claire O'Callaghan, affordable housing reporter at the Berkshire Eagle. Evan Garber, vice president of Anthony Signoli Associates, a political consulting firm that represents mostly Democrats. And Nirvani Williams, NEPM reporter. Good morning to all of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Baseball fan or not, plenty for everyone to consider today as we run down the news that you can use from the 413. Coming up, we'll discuss and perhaps debate payments in lieu of taxes on the minds of Holyoke Mayor Joshua Garcia, a proposal out this month that he plans to enact by July 1st, and attempts to meet the dire need for housing, including the state catching up with itself by releasing draft rules for accessory dwellings. But first, the headline: Springfield, the asthma capital of the U.S., has improved. Now cuts to federal funding threaten those gains. That was a piece recently in the Boston Globe. Quote, Springfield, the 2018 asthma capital of the United States, but over the past 7 years, the city has made a concerted effort to help manage people's asthma using a mix of state and federal funding to, among other initiatives, develop a widespread air monitoring system and remodel older homes prone to excess indoor pollutants. Those struggles remain. It hasn't been the asthma capital since. Now it's at risk of losing at least $19 million in federal funds it was set to receive this year to double down on some of those efforts as the Trump administration targets climate-related federal grant funding and anything related to so-called environmental justice communities. I checked in with the city yesterday, and Tina Quagliato-Sullivan, the Deputy Development Officer for Housing and Community Services and Sustainability, says that funding is still on hold. It has not been canceled. So at this point, the city is hopeful that it would be on again, although this would be the third round of kind of off on. Evan Garber, you brought this story to my attention. Why was it top of mind for you this week?
Yeah, I think it's important as we look through and hear all these national headlines about, oh my goodness, so many things are going on, so many things are getting cut, etc., that, these have real effects here in Western Massachusetts. And, I think it's sad that because there has been real progress, because 2018, like you mentioned, number one in asthma. 2024, last year, they went down to the 4 spot. That's a hard place to get out of, number 1 to 4. So I think anything that could threaten that, and even this, holding pattern, uncertainty, isn't helping anyone right now.
Yeah, and from a medical perspective, asthma isn't something we can cure. So it's really a matter of controlling environmental conditions and being aware of what's happening outside so you can prepare. Is this a day I should stay inside if I have breathing issues? Or can I retrofit my space, removing carpets, air purifier installation, just other renovation pieces? And the city has been using some of these federal dollars to help with that process. In addition, planting trees, which we all know helps purify the air, make things cooler from a temperature perspective, and healthier overall. Nirvani, I know you're out and about in the community a lot. Have you heard from groups, agencies, or individuals about any of their concerns that they're having around any of this?
Totally. It's wild to think that my first story ever that I reported for NEPM when I started as a reporter in 2021 was on Springfield being pushed to number 12 instead of the top ranking spot as the asthma capital of the world. That was according to the Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America. And that was such a big deal. And at the time, Sarita Hudson, who was the director of programs and development for the Public Health Institute of Western Mass, said that improvements really stemmed from asthma healthcare workers engaging with Springfield residents on what they needed, what they felt like they needed the city to do to help their needs and reduce triggers mainly. So I just really think this clawback of federal funding is going to be really damaging to the work that many of these public health care workers are trying to do to talk to residents who are suffering, and they have been helping people. So I really hope that nothing gets canceled yet.
Claire, out in the Berkshires, you heard from Berkshire County shelter providers about concerns that they have specific to potential loss of funding for the the Department of Housing and Urban Development. What did they tell you about their fears about the impact?
Absolutely. So when I talked to folks for this article earlier this month, they were having this, dual concern of, one, potential funding cuts, but also potential staffing cuts at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And those two things are really linked, because even if this funding does come through, if the staff is shrunk so significantly at the federal level, the funding could very well be held up, and it could be really no different than if they were not to receive the funding at all. And so when I spoke to one of the housing and homelessness agencies in the Berkshires, and it's actually the only one of these homelessness providers that does receive funding from HUD. There's two in the Berkshire County serving a growing population of people experiencing homelessness. This is the one that receives federal funding to do the work that they do. And even though they're still waiting on the status of that funding, it was already having an impact on their ability to serve the community. They weren't able to hire more staffing, which they direly need. And leases for their permanent supportive housing apartments were up, but the concern was that could they sign those leases when they know that they may not receive that funding and cannot pay it through the year? And so, even now, just the uncertainty of whether the funding will come through is already having an impact on the ability to serve people who are experiencing housing instability and homelessness in the Berkshires.
Back in the city of Springfield, the city does remain optimistic that this funding will come through. So certainly something we'll be keeping an eye on. I'm going to move us on to a different story today. Holyoke announces new policy for payments from tax-exempt organizations. That was the headline on this story from April May Munford in the Springfield Republican newspaper. Holyoke will start a new policy July 1st that will seek voluntary payments from tax-exempt institutions. The policy moves the city away from kind of this informal handshake agreement, and this will establish firm percentage amounts. Generally speaking, here in Massachusetts, government entities, universities, medical centers, other nonprofits, they just aren't subject to property taxes. And this can present a real challenge in communities. Holyoke obviously bringing this to the public fore lately. And under this pilot program, which stands for Payment in Lieu of Taxes, nonprofits not subject to property taxes agree to voluntarily pay a portion of what they would have owed if they were a regular member of the tax-paying quotient. And there are more than 900 nonprofits in Holyoke, but fewer than 10, according to the city. 10 nonprofits currently have this informal pilot agreement with the town. Evan, pilot can be a political hot potato. Are you surprised to see Mayor Garcia take this on?
I'm not totally surprised. We just talked all about this uncertainty in funding. That affects municipalities too. And for a place that's growing like Holyoke, you need tax revenue. And really, I think Holyoke and Mayor Garcia is going to be a leader on this. I would not be surprised at all if we see other municipalities, even the state government and legislatures, looking at ways to make this work. I mean, like you said, it's totally voluntary. People can opt out. In the policy that Holyoke has, it's kind of an equitable policy. If they have things where if your property value is worth this much, you're not going to pay
It's a bit of a sliding scale, as I understand
exactly.
it. So it would be around 15% if your property, the levy is less than $2 million. Excuse me, the assessed value, I should say, is less than $2 million. Could reach to as much as 25% of what your typical tax levy would have been were you not this nonprofit.
Yeah, and from what I understand, that 25% is representative of the most essential services. So they calculated that police, fire, DPW work is about 25% of the tax worth. So that's what they're trying to target.
Yeah, so as I read it, kind of that's the carrot in this proposal, right? If nonprofits are willing to play ball here and make these payments to the city, the city says they would be supporting those essential services. But it's a little tough because there's not much of a stick, right? There's not much that the city can do to require. There's actually nothing they can do to require them to pay these. And looking across Western Mass, I kind of leaned on a few reporters who I know historically have covered this issue. Paul Tuthill reminded me that Mayor Narkowitz tried this out in Northampton. Former Northampton Mayor David Narkowitz tried this back in 2015. And Smith College, which is interestingly subject to the nonprofit side, but then also is also the largest taxpayer, or was back then, in the city of Northampton because they have some nonprofit uses for the parcels of land that they own in the town. And there was a push-pull between Smith. Mayor Narkowitz said, I want you to pay X amount, and Smith came back and said, no, we're not going to. At the same time, Smith did move forward with a $300,000 donation over the course of 3 years, which they said was wholly unrelated to pilot, and they weren't going to lock themselves in. Now, Boston has an even different take on this. Under Mayor Tom Menino, back in the 2012, 2013, he pushed for pilot because if you look at Boston, it's something like half of the landmass in that city is held by nonprofit entities. And I was taking a quick look, and it doesn't look like the pilot proposal that he had put forth at that time stuck at that 25% level. Harvard and others have made some pilot payments, but not nearly as much as the mayor was seeking that time. So it's really interesting to me to think about if a big city like Boston couldn't make this work at the level they were hoping, Northampton couldn't make it stick. Is Holyoke going to be successful?
I think part of the stick could be, something that a lot of residents of, I know, our local municipalities here in Western Mass, but also broadly, I think, are looking for is transparency. I mean, anybody can go, go on GuideStar or other nonprofit databases and see, well, their executive director may be making this much, and maybe we could, help the city out a little bit, because I think it's really about partnership creating and making ways for Western Mass to work together, because we're going to need to work together because we're facing some pretty immense challenges as a region.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I was thinking about in the larger climate that we see, Josh Garcia, the mayor of Holyoke, came out a couple of years ago and said, hey, I'm going to be making this push. So this hasn't come out of the blue. It has been something that he has been talking about a little bit here and there. But I do wonder if part of the reason that this is happening now, it's going to start July 1st at the start of this new fiscal year, is related to the current climate and the federal funding clawbacks. We talked a couple of weeks ago on the show about the city of Holyoke potentially losing $19 million in federal funding.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, and I'm also thinking a little bit about nonprofits and where they're getting where they would be getting the money to participate in this program, and then also if they trust the city to help them with their nonprofit needs as well. I think it's going to be a really challenging situation, and maybe challenging for some of these nonprofits to get on board just based on what's going on.
Potentially a situation where everyone's kind of squabbling for the same grant money.
Absolutely.
Totally, yeah. I totally echo that. I mean, there's so many questions at the federal level, like the timing on it is definitely maybe an unfortunate thing.
Yeah. Well, likely more to come on this topic in Holyoke as this new approach goes live at the start of the new fiscal year, July 1st, 2025. Well, we are going to take a quick break here on The Rundown, but still ahead, we're going to talk housing and steps being taken to create more, plus scoops, praise, and prediction. Stay here on 88.5 NEPM. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. I'm Carrie Saldo, joined in studio by Claire O'Callahan from the Berkshire Eagle, political consultant Evan Garber, and NEPM news reporter Nirvani Williams. Claire, we're going to move on to two different stories that the Eagle has had in recent weeks as it expands this beat to discuss affordable housing, such a huge need across Western Massachusetts and the state of Massachusetts. The headline, Massachusetts releases long-awaited model bylaw for accessory dwelling units. Quoting your reporting, Claire, over a month after a law permitting accessory dwelling units by right in single-family zoning districts across Massachusetts kicked into effect, the state has released a model ADU bylaw. In the Berkshires and across the state, some municipalities have been waiting for the model bylaw since Governor Maura Healey signed the law last summer. Now they have a blueprint to move forward and bring their local zoning bylaws into compliance with these new regulations. So a little bit of cart before the horse on the state's side with these ADUs, but something that many people have been asking for some time. Claire, what's the reaction been to this proposed bylaw?
Yeah, I mean, as I said in the article, people have been waiting for this since August. And so, I've been following along since then. I started reporting when Governor Healey signed the Affordable Homes Act into law. And, pretty much from the beginning, people in the Berkshires were pushing for some more guidance. There were a lot of areas that folks felt were gray areas. There were a lot of questions that remained. And so a lot of the communities were feeling like it didn't make sense to move forward and, either create new bylaws or amend the bylaw that they have, when they didn't know that something that they spent so much time on would actually be in compliance with the state. And so, that was the push for some further guidelines, and then finally this model bylaw now.
And for some people who aren't familiar with accessory dwelling units, what the state is allowing is essentially for you to build a small house on your existing property by right. And in some communities, especially across the Berkshires, it was just this patchwork. Some communities said, no way, absolutely not going to be allowed. Others say, well, it had to hear the specifications. And now the state is stepping in and saying, no, by right, you can build something that is 900 square feet or less. And there are a few restrictions on it. And the state has said that they anticipate that this move will help add between 8,000 and 10,000 additional housing units over the next 5 years. And obviously, in a state where we're short around 200,000 or so housing units, this could be some really hugely important. And Governor Healey announced the law in August and effective earlier this year, as you said. Are cities and towns all buttoned up and ready to welcome those who want to build? Where's this sitting right now?
I think it's been complicated in the Berkshires since the beginning. I mean, right, they're now allowed by right with a few restrictions, but I think the approach that towns have took is very varied, even with the state coming out with this law. Some have been on it since the beginning. Some were ahead of the state and already were in compliance even before this act was passed. So now, some of the towns are saying, we don't really need to change our bylaw at all. If folks want to build one, the state allows it. We don't have to have that reflected in our local zoning. Some, have been waiting for this model bylaw. So I think it's kind of, we'll see now that they have it, how they're going to move forward.
Evan, as I said, 200,000 units shy of housing. From a political standpoint, as you see it, were ADUs kind of inevitable? The government, needed to step in, or is this a bold move by Governor Healey?
Oh, I don't think it's very bold. I mean, like 10,000 in, when we need 200,000 units, probably more, I'd say. And we've been talking so much about federal funding cuts and things. The state obviously can't pick up the tab for everything that the federal government has cut, but I mean, Governor Healey just signed a $5.1 billion housing bill, and I don't think we've seen the effects of that yet in Western Massachusetts, maybe even across the state. I think this is, how much money did it take for them to write this model bylaw? Like, I don't see much spending happening here.
Yeah, we'll see. And Claire, now the the way I was looking at it was sort of a little kind of house before the foundation in some sense or another, right, with how this goes. But the ADU bylaws created before the state issued, with the fact that these were created before the state issued the guidelines. But is there potential that they're not in full compliance with the state regulation and could just be rejected? And your reporting pointed out that the Attorney General's office is stepping in to give a little bit of help with that, right?
Right. So that's the concern that folks raise with me in the Berkshires is, yes, now we have this model bylaw, but for the municipalities that moved ahead before this, right, to try and be in compliance with the state by the February deadline, now the question is, are those bylaws that they've written going to be in compliance, right? Because they didn't have this guideline to use. So basically what the Attorney General is offering is we'll look at your draft bylaw before you actually send it to us to be approved. So if there are any, discrepancies, we can address those now.
So some clarification there, perhaps some more guidance, some clarity. Well, this is certainly something that is going to be an ongoing issue, and we'll see if that 8 to 10,000 units comes to fruition. I think one of the big challenges is materials are expensive, and even if there is a willingness on the part of a homeowner to think about, oh, hey, I could build this, rent it to someone, maybe make some additional revenue, you have to initially incur that cost. So I'm going to be really interested in watching whether the state ends up developing some sort of program or policy or incentive to help people defray that upfront cost if they're going to take on this additional risk. Something I'll be watching. Claire, something else you reported on recently, a guide to affordable housing projects in the Berkshires. I read it and I thought, that's right. There really isn't really a one-stop shop for people who are looking for affordable housing to go to. It's really confusing. I was just Googling around Western Mass affordable housing, and it looks like there's just kind of a boilerplate website that pops up when you search for affordable housing in whatever community, and then you dig through it, and it's really just a website to get you to click. It didn't really seem to provide a whole lot of help. So what gave you the idea to have this one-stop shop for where people in the Berkshires can look at different affordable housing options happening?
Absolutely. I mean, there are resources for folks that are facing housing instability, facing homelessness. There are people in the Berkshires that are building to meet this housing crisis, right? But, when I speak with folks who are directly experiencing, some form of housing instability, experiencing homelessness, you're in a very vulnerable place. And with the example of the person that I spoke with for this story, right, she's a single mom. She has a very young son. She's working. She wants to go back to school to become a nurse. And she's about to get kicked out of her, long-term apartment. And there's a scramble, right, to find somewhere to live pretty quickly. And so when you think about it like that, people don't have all that amount of time to go search out these resources, right? And so especially for someone like her who needs, some kind of affordable housing, she can't afford the market rate apartment in the Berkshires on her own salary. She, just felt like she didn't know where to go, where to find the updates on these apartments that are, currently in development, in design. And so that kind of gave me the idea of why don't I just check in with all these people? I know what these buildings are. I know the people that I could ask about, how do you qualify? What are going to be the rents? And so that was the idea of just let's put this all in one place that's easily accessible for folks.
And it was interesting to look through your primer because it helped me to realize that there are currently 5 different projects in central and southern Berkshire County in various states of readiness that are going to bring a few hundred affordable housing units to the county. Now, on the face of it, it doesn't sound like a huge number given the amount of housing that we're lacking, but those are some pretty big strides happening all at once in Berkshire County, right?
They are. I recently went to a lottery for one of those buildings that are on the list, and there was probably about 10 people sitting there, and 10 people, 10 apartments, that's really nothing compared to the amount of units that we need. But when you're hearing these individual stories, people who have recently a year ago lost their husband or are sleeping on their cousin's couch for a year. I mean, you think about that, like the grief, and then also kind of that chaos and instability and not having a place to go in that moment. Like, that's a real person that really needs that unit, and it will mean something to them.
Well, Claire, I'm so appreciative to the Eagle for this affordable housing beat that they have developed, and I hope that other area reporting entities will see the value and maybe add that beat to their lineup as well. It's certainly fascinating and definitely needed. Nirvani.
I agree. I just reading your article, I thought it was brilliant. It was, I'm jumping the gun, but one of the praise that I wanted to give in the scoop praise category, I reported on some challenges that people faced with housing and getting a housing voucher a year ago with Karen Brown, another reporter in the NEPM newsroom. And it's extremely difficult to even get into the lottery. It's a very chaotic system to navigate, and then it's it's a slim chance of getting any sort of help or getting a housing voucher anyway. So this was just an incredible guide that you put together, and such amazing reporting. So super cool.
Yeah, both your reporting on this has been so good of looking at the human aspect of it, which is so important, that part of the story, because it's easy to get lost in the numbers for sure.
Well, Nirvani, I wanted to ask you quickly about a story you did this week, and it sort of speaks to the intersection of politics and AI. What was going on there?
Yeah, definitely. This was a wild story, which kind of feels like a divergence from focusing on federal budget cuts, but it's relevant to local news and residents. In a social media post, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance criticized the head of Springfield's NAACP President Bishop Talbert Swan II because Swan said that he heard an audio clip he believed to be Vance throwing insults at Trump advisor Elon Musk, and wrote in a post on X that the infighting has begun, and Vance responded to Swan's tweet and pretty much said that audio wasn't him and it was AI generated.
So to me, this really speaks to the importance of fact check before you post.
Yes.
And Evan, AI in politics, what is this doing right now?
If you had an answer to that, we could all be billionaires, I think. We don't really know what it's doing yet, but it's definitely changing the game in so many ways. I mean, we saw it. The Republicans used it a lot better than the Democrats did in 2024. I mean, it's clear they're using easily recognizable, targeted AI algorithms to get people to where they're at. And that's, I think, the future of vote getting and even polling. But the deep fakes things and stuff, that technology is only going to get I'd say worse, but I think tech people would say the technology is only going to get better.
It is worse. I completely agree with you. It's
so
scary because it's really hard to suss out fact from fiction.
I completely agree with both of you. And I think that's the problem here, too, is that Swan was telling me that he was looking for some sort of verification of whether or not this was real or not from Vance's team, and they weren't able to get him
I
that.
think, too, we'll see a lot more politicians saying, oh, that was a deepfake, that was AI, when in reality it was definitely them.
Yeah.
So that's speculation, but we'll see on that.
I also think from my perspective, it's just a reminder. If you're uncertain, perhaps err on the side of not posting, right? And perhaps then the confusion, the conflict could be then avoided. Yeah. All right. Well, I will move us to Scoop's Praise Prediction. Nirvani, we heard yours, but this is where we ask our panel to make a prediction about the news or maybe dish on a story they're working on. Claire O'Callaghan.
Yeah, so if you're tired of listening to me talk about housing, write about housing, this is a good moment to be, because I spent the last week on writing about something very not housing related. Folks have been asking kind of where the Berkshire is at with measles vaccination rates, with everything happening across the country at this moment. And an article in our paper tomorrow will have the answer for you.
All right. Well, they can take a look. Evan Garber, very quickly, Scoop, prediction, praise.
I'd like to praise our all Gen Z panel and the Manhattan East Hampton Rail Trail Committee for going out to bid on the grant to repave the parts of the trail.
All right, you heard it here on The Rundown. I want to thank our panelists, Claire O'Callahan, Evan Garber, and Nirvani Williams. You have been listening to The Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. Thoughts about today's show or ideas for a future one? Email therundown@nepm.org. I'm Carrie Saldo. Get out there and have a great Friday, everybody.
The Rundown on NEPM is funded by UMass Economics, presenting Understanding Minimum Wage and Immigration Policies, Cause and Effect and Evidence-Based Approaches with David Card, UCal Berkeley labor economist, April 3rd at 5 in Bowker Auditorium.
On this week's Wait, Eric Idle talks about a wild party he threw with Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford and how it changed film history.
This party went on all night, and they were finally picked up by their cars at 6 o'clock. And I'm happy to say I ruined one of the scenes in Star Wars.
And Peter Sagal will join us as we get more such secrets from Eric Idle and the stars of Somebody Somewhere. So join us for this week's Wait from NPR.
Listen for Wait, Don't Tell Me tomorrow morning at 11 or Sunday at noon. The BBC NewsHour is next. This is 88.5 NEPM. It's 9:36.